Welcome to World Nuclear Association's Strategic eForum 2020, Driving Investment Towards Nuclear Projects. This webinar will start in a few moments. We would like to thank our sponsors, Centris, Kazatomprom, KHNP, Nuclear 21, Rosatom, and Urenco. In a few moments, we will join our moderator, George Borovas.
Hello to everybody around the world. My name is George Borovas. I will be the moderator of this panel today, and welcome to the WNA eForum. I'm joining you today from Tokyo, and where I'm a nuclear industry lawyer. And for the past 20 years, I've been helping advise the nuclear clients around the world on the development and financing of nuclear projects. This is why this panel is of particular importance and interest to me. It's close to my heart and dear to my heart. We have a great industry that has fantastic technologies, wonderful people, but one of the things that we can do better is to start developing our projects in a more efficient way, driving down the costs, and help attracting further financing from other players outside of this industry. So in order to talk about this today, we have assembled a star panel, a truly star panel from around the world. And I will introduce each one in turn. First is Leonardo Dosatos, CEO of Electronuclear in Brazil. It's Justin Christensen, partner of Ozira. Zen Mingwan, chief engineer at SPIC. Ilya Rebrov, Chief Financial Officer of Rosatom, as well as Bogdan Zronek, member of the Board of Directors and Chief Nuclear Officer of ČEZ. I'm going to ask now the panelists to give us some introductory remarks, brief introductory remarks, before we go into a question and answer session. So first of all, can I ask Bogdan to speak, please?
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I suppose we all can agree that we need and we will need secure energy supply for reasonable prices and power supply from power sources which are acceptable for everybody if possible. Where are we now? We are heading to CO2-free future, especially European Union speeds its targets from 32.5 to current suggestion 55, or from the point of European Parliament 65% of CO2 reductions till 2030, and then to continue to zero emissions. If you look at the ENSOE, which is Grid Operators Network forecast for 2040, we are heading to big troubles. In Europe, most of countries will be hardly self-sufficient in power production, and it will be very difficult where to buy or where to import from. Power production is now more the matter of ideology and policy than the technical issue. This creates a tough environment for any power source construction and financing, as we operate usually stock market utilities, and we all have to meet all of laws and requirements and corporate rules. So reasonable financing became a real challenge for any power source and for any company and any country. We can have national strategies, but to finance any source, especially nuclear, it needs governmental involvement and support in general. So let's discuss how to reach this goal and how to secure reasonable energy mix for the future.
Thank you very much, Bogdan. Now may I ask Mr. Rebrov from Rosatom to, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, first, let me thank you for this opportunity to participate in Strategic Forum organized by the WNA. I'm absolutely sure that the topic which is on agenda is of highest priority today. Development of our nuclear power plants product is stipulated by the demand structure of the global energy market and needs of our clients. One of the major questions that is on clients' decision list is the question about the source of financing. Sources and mechanisms of financing vary, as well as the methods of legal arrangement of the relevant relations between customer and provider. Within the last 10 years, our product has developed dramatically. On our side, we started with widespread energy market approach of EPC, engineering, procurement, and construction, plus essential regulatory framework services, which are very basic and common. Now we sell an integrated offer, including almost all the components of future electric power cost. Starting with our build, own, operate projects, we also provide financing solution, which contributes to the competitiveness of our product. Nuclear construction projects were typically implemented under the state protection, and in rare cases, the private investors could be invited and are also eager to participate in such projects. Nevertheless, the situation is changing now, and at present, we could really acknowledge that the market for new build shall be much broader. In case of the integrated offer of Rosatom, will be supplemented with the financing or co-financing of the project. In my opinion, nuclear power plant projects meet interest of both financial and operational investors. Financial investors through nuclear projects receive tools to address main challenges to gain profit and secure risks, as nuclear projects grant stable and long-term return of investment and allow to increase share value proportionally closer to commercial operation date of the project. As for operational investors, they receive opportunity to service all the participants of the project during the construction phase. I believe that most of new projects in nuclear and other segments of power generation could be implemented with tools of project financing. Just to remind, it means quite extensive leverage. The loan could be up to 70% of the total package and even more. Project's operational cash flow is the single or the main source of investment repayment. All project risks have mitigation measures, including all kinds of performance bonds of suppliers. Lenders' investment is secured by project company pledged assets. Application of the project financing tools is a long journey. Rosatom started with small projects, and each year we increased the size and the scope of the projects to create expertise, so to further apply the project financing tools to nuclear power plant projects. The main question to be resolved each time is how to prepare the new build projects for financing obtaining. Thank you. George.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rebrov. Appreciate these very nice comments. Now we go to Mr. Zheng Minguan. Please go ahead, Mr. Zheng.
Good evening. Nice to meet you. I would like to present in China. But firstly, I would like to cover the energy supply situations. And first, this year, we met very challenging event crisis. They suggested coronavirus. And on one hand, such an event reduced the power consumptions. So the electric power generation this year actually gradually reduced due to such event. But on the other hand, with the intelligence, especially with the 5G, with the big data system, the power consumption actually increase. So in the future, like today, we use the network system, use such a video system. So in future, we think that the power consumption would be increased. So this actually for the nuclear power is the best opportunity. As you know, the nuclear power would spend several years to do the construction. So for time being, the economy is not good, but in 5 years, when the nuclear power put into operation, maybe the economy needs such a power, support. And general picture about the power consumption in China, last year we spent about 7,500 terawatt hour, about the 30% in the world, power consumption. And in China, for the time being, the total nuclear power is about 2.4% in the grid connections. China will reach about 20,000 gigawatt. So nuclear power about the 50 gigawatt. And the power generation about the nuclear power is only 4.6%. So compared with the world, average level, we think China would greatly develop the nuclear power in the future. This will drive, the economic development. And for time being, China will build the passive technology. As you know, to compare with the other technologies, especially with high safety, simplified system, less equipment, and with such features, it would result into the good economy. And as you know, we built 4 AP1 sonde in China. AP1 sonde is the technology that originates from the Westinghouse. And since last 8 years, we completed the construction. Up to now, all 4 units of AP1 sonde operates very good. And especially as the less equipment, less maintenance, and especially the shortest of the outage for the nuclear refueling. Here, just to mention that such 4 new reactors at the first year, they reached the world record of the operation. And for the first outage, like Summer 1, only 46 days, and the third one, Taiyang 2, only 30 days for outage. In the future, we can see that the outage could reduce down to the 30 days. So the passive technology actually has very good, the operation performance. And now I just sit nearby the new project, the CAP 1400, and the construction of the 2 units of CAP 1400 progress smoothly. And with such a 2 bigger unit, we think it would contribute the power supply in the future after, the crisis of the coronavirus. And we also try to build the heating reactor. As you know, in China, we spend a lot of the carbon, and the carbon will result into the air pollution. And with the new technology of the heating reactor, such a situation could be changed. And we propose to use the philosophy like near zero risk, near zero weather efficient, and this will no impacts to the environment, but will provide the clean energy and the clean heating, especially for the area in the northern China. And in the future, how can we enhance the economy of the nuclear power and to try to get the investment from industry? We think the most features from the new reactors or technologies should be proposed. For example, the passive safety system, less safety equipment, the complete supply chain should be established. In China, we spent about 15 years used the national key project, and we developed the complete supply chain. And with the complete supply chain, the less risk and the less cost could be spent for the equipment procurement. And also we used the modular construction with the less construction period, and this just enhanced the economic performance. And then the proven mode of construction, that is very important for the erection, for the management, and just to reduce the risk in the project progress. And also we should propose to use a batch or scale construction and to sustainable develop the projects. With such efforts, we think the construction, the industry could be stable. So we just say that for the nuclear power in the future, should use the comprehensive utilization, especially not only for the power supply, but also for the multiple applications such as the heating, the steam supply, the hydrogen production, and the distillation if the nuclear power plant nearby the sea. In China, like CAP 1400, the power generation cost is about 6 cents per kilowatt, plus the heating about $6 per gigajoule of the heat. And for the heat reactor, if there's no other applications like the power supply, then the cost of or price for the heating could be more expensive, like $50 per gigajoule. We think in China, the nuclear power could be more promising, as China is the big country, and we have the less, the primary energy resources, especially nearby the sea, with the more economic, developed. So at this area, we need to use the big reactors to provide the electricity. And with the small reactors in the northern China, because these areas much more cold, and in the winter normally use the carbon, the air is polluted. So in the future, we think use the heating reactor would change the situations. So in China, we think the big one to supply the electricity, the small one to provide the multiple applications. So the nuclear power in China, we just below is promising. Thank you. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zeng Yuan. Great to hear from you and your experiences from China. Our next speaker is Justin Christensen, please.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you for the invitation, and also to the WNA for the invitation for me to join the panel today. I thought that in preparing for today's session, I thought I would organize my preliminary remarks around what some of the key challenges are for, as I perceive them, for nuclear generation, what the implications of those are, and therefore what they might suggest then for a potential way, a tentative way forward, let's say, on how to drive down the costs and to improve the conditions for financing of new nuclear. I guess the first key challenge I'd highlight would be that we observe that over time that government commitment, if you like, to nuclear technologies as part of the overall generation mix in their countries can vary significantly over time. And obviously they vary very greatly also across different countries as well. Historically, we have seen that public acceptance and concerns around safety, the large costs of nuclear as perceived by governments and the citizenry in different countries, at least as compared to other renewable generation technologies, for example, those coming down of late, has also been a concern. And also, I think, concerns around the kind of appropriate allocation of different risks associated with nuclear generation between different stakeholders has also been a particular challenge. I think the varying commitment on, or the, let's say, inconstant commitment by governments to nuclear generation technologies, therefore can make the investment conditions for nuclear generation very uncertain. And this can also then result in there not being, let's say, as good an achievement of, or not achieving the economies of scale that really should be available in the nuclear generation sector, and the ability to then bring costs down over the long term can sometimes be missed. The second point I'd highlight would be that clearly the nuclear generation is a long-lived asset. And it also has, some long-term liabilities, of course, as well. And this then is likely to require some risk transfer from perhaps the private sector to the public sector, particularly as regards waste management and final disposal. And establishing these kinds of regulatory arrangements and contractual arrangements can be difficult to achieve sometimes, and also quite time-consuming. The third thing I'd highlight would be that particularly in liberalized electricity systems, for example, in the European Union, the United States, in the UK, and so forth, sometimes the market arrangements that are put in place for pricing of electricity do not necessarily reflect the true underlying costs and benefits of different technologies, or at least their costs and benefits in terms of overall, to the overall system. And so nuclear, renewable, gas-fired generation technologies differ greatly in their characteristics and their generation profile, their output profiles, and so forth. And in the long run, the sort of system cost-reducing benefits of nuclear may not always be kind of truly reflected in the prices that consumers pay. And this can come from a number of different reasons. For example, grid costs. Very often these are socialized or spread across the generality of customers rather than being attributed or charged to particular users of the system. including at the generation level. Also, the costs associated with providing balancing services or ensuring that there's enough backup generation to cover those periods where, for example, renewables aren't generating. Those costs very often don't necessarily get priced in as effectively as they could be in some cases. And then finally, the costs of emissions. So the carbon price, for example, that very often either governments use or which markets, price the prices at which markets for greenhouse gas emission allowances, for example, they may not reflect the true long-term costs and risks of climate change. And so as a result, all of these things together imply that the value for money of nuclear generation as compared to other competing generation technologies may not be fully reflected in market prices. So what is to be done about this? I think one of the key things, particularly in relation to, I think the first point I mentioned around government commitment by governments to nuclear generation and the development of nuclear generation technologies, I would say is the critical one. And I think in relation to this, and particularly as governments in the European Union and elsewhere are looking to considering different pathways and different ways to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that their economies are emitting, it means that it's vital that the nuclear industry provides a clear and credible case for nuclear generation benefits to the systems and the countries in which those nuclear plants operate over the long run. Also, I think one of the key things that can be done would then be to obviously ensure that the nuclear generation sector or the nuclear sector pulls together and provides, if you like, the mechanisms and develops the procedures to and arrangements that will enable to the sector to reduce costs and to reduce also the risk of cost overruns in the long term. I think achieving that, I think ultimately requires cooperation with governments, particularly in relation to financing arrangements, which I know we'll get onto later. And I think really the financing considerations will be the key area for the nuclear sector to let's say, improve upon in the future. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Justin, for these remarks. And the last of the introductory remarks now are to come from Leonardo Dosatos. Thank you. Leonardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, George. Thank you, WNA, for the invitation. And my introductory comments is very similar for Mr. Justin. In fact, driving investment to our nuclear projects or energy projects depends strongly in the perception and valuation of the costs associated to these projects. Comparing the costs of different power generation technologies has become one of the main arguments used by proponents of specific sources and those seeking to find the best approach to plan the expansion of electric systems. However, this approach taken alone for public energy policy making is far from simple and can lead to unwanted and unexpected results. How much does it cost? It seems like a simple question. However, when it comes to competing power generation technology, it's an extremely challenging question. Generation costs include many variables: capital, fuel, location, waste disposal, environmental impact, interconnection, reliability, intermittency, and other external and systemic costs. No two technologies are alike. System costs are often classified into four broadly defined categories of profile costs, also referred as utilization costs or backup costs, balancing costs, grid costs, and connection costs. The external costs are based upon the sum of three components: climate change damage costs associated with emissions of greenhouse gases, CO2 and others, damage costs such as impacts on health, crops, etc., associated with other air pollutants as NOx, SO2, NH3, and other non-environmental social costs for non-fossil electricity generation technology. Environmental and social externalities are highly site-specific, and so results will vary widely, even within a given country, according to the geographic position. And the main point to be discussed is, I believe, that cost is not value. Not always the cost reflect the value, and is the value of the electricity, like Mr. Christensen said, is the main point for the future, for the expansion of the electric systems in the future. This is the challenge, to associate, to approach cost of the value. In fact, this is this introductory remarks. We can go through this during the webinar. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. And that's the conclusion of the introductory remarks. We're now going to go into the question and answer session. Due to the limitations of these Zoom kind of conferences and discussions, we have opted to have direct questions to the speakers as opposed to having a discussion amongst the speakers. I think it's easier for the audience to follow. So the first question I'm going to pose to Mr. Zhang about how do the costs of nuclear energy compare to other forms of generation, and how do we drive down costs for nuclear build to make it more attractive to investors? Mr. Zhang.
Generation price in China is not so expensive to compare with the fossil, to compare with the new energy. For time being, the new energy price is still higher than the nuclear power and the fossil. And also in the future, as you see, the new energy, like solar energy, like the wind energy, could have more. But with such a more energy from the solar and the winds, you need the stability of the network system. You need, the power change or power follow. So in this case, the fossil power plant is still necessary. But who responsible for the baseload operation? We think the nuclear power could take the role of such a baseload operation. So the nuclear power, the market is still there. And the second, how to drive down or to get the competent, price of the nuclear power. We think first the proven technology, and with the incorporation of the new technology. But you still not too much risks in the new technology. For example, to be delayed or to have more investment to compare with the budget. So in this case, you should control all of such a new technology to be applied. And second, as I just mentioned, we should establish the complete supply chain. This is very important. Like the supply chain competent and competition, in China, 12 years ago, when I just planned the supply chain, I actually selected more than 2 suppliers for each product. So they can have a compete in all the areas, from technology, from price, from the management, from the quality assurance, and also for the technology development. So in such a case, they can maintain the, the adequate prices for all the items. So in the future, like the CAP 1400, we just have such a budget, and that is very competent. The price, as I just said, the power generation per kilowatt is about 6 cents. In the future, we can realize that in China.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and it reflects a lot of common themes that we've seen around the world, what you describe, and these are very valuable lessons that you described to us today. For the next question, I will go to Mr. Rebrov of Rosatom, and I would like to ask you, Mr. Rebrov, what are the key challenges of financing nuclear power plant construction projects from an investor's point of view, in your view?
Thank you for your question. Based on my experience and my expertise from numerous meetings with all kinds of investors, I would like to focus on the following main challenges. First of all, it's a long investment phase and quite long payback period. Nobody wants to accept uncertainty for a long period. And usually nobody understands that the period of uncertainty is much smaller than the overall period of undertaking. Quality of adequate security. Everybody wants state guarantees, all kind of state security. And in main instances, in a larger number of instances, we have some purchase agreements, contract for differences, and some other agreements that could be used as security. We also use project bonds, green or sustainable bond on the operational phase of the project. All kind of investors require additional or special guarantees that the project shall be implemented on time and without any significant cost overrun, because these are very capital-intensive projects and very complex projects, and we have several not very good examples of time delays and cost overruns globally in some projects. We can discuss how to share or how to cover some of commercial project risks with the investors, but these are the risks that cannot be accepted by any investor. These are political or regulatory risks that could be covered only by the hosting country and by the provider. Nuclear power plant as a number of assets, buildings and equipment could not be used as a security for the loan. That's a very important difference from other projects, from other even power generation projects. And the investors are not able and are not ready to take possession of such assets as a collateral. And as a final challenge, not all banks even accept to work with the nuclear industry. We work very extensively with, of course, with the risk of time delays and cost overruns. And we usually invite the investors into our project not in the first phase, while we are trying to grant, to receive the licenses from the state, during the period that we are preparing the design and all kind of operational plans. We do not invite the investors. We start to work with them, but we are discussing just very high level numbers and parameters of the project. And by the time we have a license, we have the technical design is finished. By the time when we have all the supply chain and production or construction plans in place, there's a time when we understand the level of the overall project risk is adequate for investors, and we are starting to work with them with the papers, with more details. Concerning the management of construction risks or project risks, we started quite long ago several projects united in one program called Total Cost of Management in nuclear construction, and we aim the result of that program primarily at a greater grip on the risks that could lead to shifting deadlines and additional construction costs. That's about all, George.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rebrov. And you know, these are very, very interesting remarks. And what you said a couple of times about the issue about that are banks, financial institutions that do not work with nuclear, and that is something that we see in their policies. Sometimes they don't quite know exactly why they have those policies, and that's part of our work as an industry to try to get them more comfortable with what nuclear does and why is it such a safe and reliable technology for the production of electricity. Yes.
I believe that in most cases, in most such cases, we do not see nuclear projects in the agenda of these banks, just because the projects are very complex. Too complex and lots of phases, lots of participants, We need to understand this complexity to the banks and to make the whole process more transparent.
Absolutely, you're absolutely correct. And I think, as I always say, is that speaking the language of the banks and speaking to them in their language, not in our language, is very vitally important. Thank you very much for these wonderful remarks, Mr. Rubrov. Now I'm going to go to Leonam, and I would like to ask you, Leonam, about what can the nuclear sector do to instill confidence in investors and lower the risk premium of nuclear projects, in your view?
I think that we must, before thinking about instill confidence in investors, we must consider that investors are people before being investors. So I believe that there is a big effort to instill confidence in people. If you get this confidence in people, the investors follow on. When we talk about build confidence, we are talking about public attitudes. So some components of public attitudes are fundamental to instill confidence. The first one is government leadership. No nuclear without strong leadership from the government, for a number of reasons, is evidently. The second point is the public opinion at national level. We must build this acceptance, public acceptance at national level. It's difficult if you are talking about a big country, a diverse country, like our country, Brazil. But we must work very hard in local level opinion. Local level opinion is fundamental. And normally, local level opinion is much more acceptance than the national level opinion. Mainly because the familiarity with the plants due to the benefits, perceived benefits they have from these plants. Another point is to go out with the phantoms, phantoms like Fukushima, like Chernobyl. When we think that these phantoms fade away, they reappear recently by the HBO series about Fukushima. But we must build public support, no? And to build public support, we must get trust, understanding of the risk, and mainly understanding risk governance. No? That point. And also, the last but not the least, is the community benefit, is the perception of to pass the perception that the community is very beneficial for the community, this kind of nuclear power plant in the region. This is the point of public attitudes, but you have also aspects associated to business model. You must be very clear the market insertion, also the commercialization of the energy in long term. It's very important to nuclear, as nuclear is a big investment in long term of maturation, reasonable situation of commercialization and market insertion. Another point in some countries has a discussion is the ownership of nuclear power plants. The options of state, private, state-owned companies, national, foreigner, the combination of four positions. This is a very particular situation for each country. But this situation is still, of course, a good combination of this instill confidence in investors. Another point is supply chain and skills. We must identify that if there is some potential bottlenecks and future delays, this is very important to identify at the beginning and to solve this problem before construction starts. Also, the opportunities for local business. This is a very strong effect. If you have significant opportunities for local business, it's a strong incentive to investors. And also the skills. If you have these skills in the country, or you must create these skills and what the time schedule to create these skills. And finally, the technology selection. And when I talk about technology selection, we are talking about first of a kind, end of a kind, projects that are already units in operation, units in construction, or units only in design, and technical aspects associated to safety, passive safety, active safety. This is another point that instills confidence in the investors. But to conclude this, I believe that the confidence is achieved by a good nuclear governance. And what we call nuclear governance? We call what we the 3S plus EP. 3S is safety, security, safeguards, plus EP, emergency preparedness. And I include L, the liability. If you have this governance well established, we have good conditions to instill confidence in investors, to lower the risk premium of nuclear projects. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Leonardo, and thank you for this very comprehensive 360-degree view of instilling confidence in investors and how you view it. Only a CEO can see the entire picture like this. Very, very interesting remarks. I particularly like the way that you describe the issue that investors are first people. And I think it's vitally important to speak to people in plain language to make them understand what it is that we do, what are the challenges, what are the good, what is the bad. And sometimes I think as a nuclear industry people, we speak in terms that frighten people. So I think it's something that we can always do better. So thank you very much for these great remarks.
George,
I'm going to go. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, George, for this point, I would like to add some comments. First, to build the confidence of the nuclear power, first, actually, the government should have the planning for the future. If government no planning, the industry could, provided the loan, provided the funds to support this development. And the second, the industry itself, especially for the nuclear power industry, they should build their confidence with the new technology, safe technology, and economic technology. And the third, for the nuclear power industry or nuclear power market, the nuclear power, for example, the heating, the nuclear power generation should be more competent. For the price lower than others. So this actually just to give the sharing or give the benefits for the general people. And the general people with such benefits, they can build their confidence. So I think such 3 points from industry, from government, from publics, also the 3 parties should be shared. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And exactly, it is all of the stakeholders putting together, seeing it from their perspective and how they do it and working together in order to develop these projects to bring in more investment from others. Thank you very much. I'm going to move now to Justin Christensen. Now, I'll ask you, Justin, there are new funding models for investment in nuclear generation that are being proposed now. Which, in your opinion, offers the best potential, or which ones?
Yeah, I'm glad you added that last comment at the end there, George, because I think there have obviously been a number of models that have been tried and tested in the past. And as we heard today, project financing and so on is also something that has great potential. I won't touch so much on that, but I guess a spoiler alert a little bit for the remarks I'm about to make would be that I guess different countries or in different markets and different governments and different investors and so forth will clearly have different preferences, and there will be different considerations in each individual case. So it's very difficult to say with any degree of sort of great certainty and confidence that any particular model, financing model, would be, as it were, the first best in all cases. So with that in mind, I guess some of the sort of funding models that certainly we have seen in the past. I think the first one is, and again, aligned with the remarks that we've been making in the discussion around the importance of the partnership with government. Clearly, public finance, public ownership of nuclear plants has obviously been historically a very important source of new financing, and indeed for future financing, I would imagine, also for nuclear new build in the future. in some cases, again, with more maybe with an eye to the governments or the jurisdictions or the markets where governments have had a more inconstant or more wavering, let's say, commitment to nuclear generation. You know, sometimes there's a reliance on a sort of strategic asset rationale for governments to get involved in nuclear generation, and particularly in the current circumstances, and again in liberalized markets, electricity markets, for example, and particularly also in countries where there's a strong emphasis on decarbonization and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and environmental sustainability, then clearly, given the rapidly falling costs of some other low carbon generation technologies, notably renewable generation technologies of various forms, can make it challenging for governments to justify involvement in nuclear new build, particularly if the perception is the costs in this sector are not falling as rapidly. Also, I think in terms of another challenge to public finance, at least in some countries, is the sort of recent experience we've had around the macroeconomic developments connected with financial crises of various kinds in various places, and also, of course, the recent pandemic, which has introduced an entirely new dimension to the consideration of the macroeconomic risks, and the governments are increasingly acutely aware of these kinds of let's call it high impact, low probability events, and going forward. I think in terms of another sort of very tried and tested model has been in the past the corporates, particularly utilities, financing nuclear plants on their balance sheets. But again, in some markets, the competition that has been introduced and the contestability within the electricity markets that we have seen has meant that that is sometimes difficult or has weighed down, if you like, on the balance sheet capacity of some of those utilities over the last, say, 10, 15 years. Alongside that, the focus on renewable generation of late has meant that, again, alongside an uncertain commitment on the part of governments sometimes, also I think some of these utilities, or the large utilities, are increasingly focused to align with decarbonization and the renewables agenda. And I think that, combined with potential challenges to the balance sheet capacity of that sector, means that we might not see as much investment coming forward with that model in future. A third option that is very often used for energy infrastructure and more generally is obviously relying on long-term contracts between the generators and their users. We've seen this in France. We see a form of this in Finland as well, I suppose you could say. But again, I think particularly in the context of liberalized electricity markets, it is sometimes difficult to reconcile having a relatively small number of very large energy intensive users with very long-term contracts for offtake of power from nuclear generation plants, and to reconcile that with the liberalized market arrangements and the sort of competition and the competitiveness that governments are very often, and competition authorities and regulators are trying to achieve in their markets. Also, alongside this, once you have long-term contracts, particularly when they are very long-term, means that contract disputes can be very difficult to resolve, and we've seen that challenges in that area is also maybe a dissatisfying factor for some developers or some off-takers as well, using long-term contracts as a basis for further investment in the future. That brings us then to kind of a fairly wide or large bucket or category of different approaches, which essentially are based around government subsidies and support mechanisms, enabling in various ways private finance to come to the table and to provide a very significant amount of competitive capital, let's say, that can be utilized to great effect in the infrastructure sector. Recent examples of this include, for example, feed-in tariffs with contracts for differences and so forth. This is a model that has been used in the UK and elsewhere. And I think this is something that has gained some prominence also, or has also been discussed, I think, more frequently, let's say, more recently, also with respect to nuclear generation. There are clearly examples of this, Hinkley Point C being a notable one. But I think fundamentally in this, I think one of the key challenges there is that the construction risk is still by and large borne by the developer or the ultimate generator. And given the remarks that myself and others in the panel have been making around the inconstancy potentially of government commitment to nuclear generation and the inevitable kind of change in the incentives on the part of the government, before and after a nuclear plant is built, means that it can be difficult to rely, let's say, on the support schemes being in place in the way they were originally envisaged long term. And also market arrangements also can change very dramatically, which can have an impact on the business cases, if you like, of the different plants as well. So that takes me then to another kind of new model, I guess, that is only being discussed really quite recently in the last couple of years or so. And that is the application of the so-called regulatory asset-based model for new nuclear generation. This model, the regulatory asset-based model, also referred to as the RAB model, stems from the long experience that countries have had with regulating the tariffs that can be charged by infrastructure providers to their customers, particularly in the energy sector. Transmission and distribution networks and various other infrastructures, network infrastructures, are very often regulated through this kind of approach. And the thinking recently has been that possibly this approach could also be used to facilitate the investment in new nuclear generation. I think the upside potential here is potentially very great, particularly because there are lots of, let's say, infrastructure investors out there who are seeking to place their money in long-term assets. And as a pension fund or as an infrastructure investor with a long-term horizon and having a more patient, let's say, attitude to the capital allocation, this could be a very competitive source of capital that could be unlocked by something like the RAB model, particularly as these investors are very familiar with this model in other sectors for other assets. The key consideration here, though, is that, again, coming back to remarks that I was making earlier, the risk transfer is something that obviously in this case would need to be developed, more or less from scratch. I'm not aware of any instances where the RAB model has been used directly, at least in the recent past. But I think particularly in the UK context where this is being actively discussed, the arrangements need to be developed. And again, this can take time, but I think the upside potential there is quite considerable. I think one of the key challenges here is perhaps the polar opposite one of the feed-in tariffs and the contracts for difference model, which is that in the RAB model, the users, the consumer, the energy user, will be partly funding potentially the construction of the plant, before it is completed. And I think that is something that I guess as a point of risk transfer and risk allocation efficiency is something that simply needs to be worked out. But I think provided this can be overcome, then certainly the RAB model is one that I would say has, potentially can do a lot of good, I think, in terms of bringing forward investment in certain markets at certain times, and particularly where there's a culture of using and consistent regulation in the infrastructure sector over time, as in the case in the UK and European countries and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. And it's a great kind of overview of all the different funding models and the different approaches, including RAB, which is obviously very exciting and interesting at this point. But I think that, that what's very important about what you said is that based on the market you're in, based on the project, based on the power market, based on the approach that any country has, figuring out the funding mechanism and the funding model has to come first before you start anything else. Once you do that, then eventually you can start reverse engineering and start answering the other questions for your project. Because many times we've seen examples where people start with technology choice, and then eventually after they put everything together, then they start talking about how we're going to fund it. So, answering these kind of questions that you just posed now, very beginning at the project, is vitally important in order to give you the answers to give you the direction to which you can take your project. So thank you very much for that.
If I just make one remark in addition to that, which is that, again, with respect to the UK context, I think the RAB model is being actively discussed. It is actually also being used as one of the potential ways in which the the cost reduction objectives for the nuclear sector can also be achieved. In the UK, there has been a much trumpeted sort of UK nuclear sector deal that was established a few years ago. And I think this is something that has as an ambition to reduce nuclear new build costs by a substantial margin compared to, say, the recent example with Hinkley Point C. And I think the RAB model is being touted as one of the potential tools in the tool chest, let's say, that can be used to achieve that objective.
Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you. Let me go now to Bogdan Zronek to ask you something a little bit different. It goes back to the issue of finance and sustainable finance. So internationally, there is currently a lack of a globally agreed definition of sustainable finance, and with varying interpretation of what constitutes good sustainable finance governance. What are your views going forward on the development of clearly defined international principles and standards that includes all low carbon technologies? Bogdan?
Oh, thank you for the question. In general, the world is failing to give clear understanding what does sustainable mean. We may agree to reduce fossil fuels burning. We may understand the gas as a transition technology, but generally countries are hesitating, or international organizations are hesitating to discuss the role of CO2-free nuclear, which brings uncertainty, and not taking this into account, not taking all inputs into account, we are losing time and wasting the time to bring the clear solution. What I believe we really need is a broadly agreed understanding of sustainable. We need to have clear criteria for everybody, criteria which are not spoiled by any ideology and by any kind of lobbying. Criteria which would take into account all of inputs, including construction, operation, decommissioning, and if decommissioning altogether, front and back end of fuel cycle, and it doesn't matter which fuel cycle it is, environmental impacts, maybe grid costs, which brings the operation of any kind of source, which is very difficult and very tough discussion. To get to some resolution, I believe it needs to be some strong international entity to lead this discussion to get to some results. I can agree with introductory remarks of Jostein or Leonam that we need to evaluate full costs or full value of any kind of source. So bad example is European taxonomy and European evaluation of sustainable, or using do not significant harm criteria in case of nuclear, because nuclear in Europe and its evaluation is being set aside, and it's a more political and ideological issue than the matter of technical inputs, and nuclear is in vacuum and nobody cares. But being a bank or being an investor, it's a very unsecure environment to invest in this technology. So we have to look for any kind of solution, as Jostein introduced just a minute ago. And if we fix construction and operational costs, then the bigger part of new build investment is the cost of money. So everybody is looking how to reduce the cost of money in general. And having a clear criteria of sustainable, it will help everybody, because it would bring at least fair conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bogdan. And I think, you know, it's what you say is very true with like looking at this from that perspective and see how we define sustainable and how nuclear plays a part of that sustainable development has become even more urgent today and for the past few years with climate change, with air pollution. So I think that, you know, I see a change globally about the attitude towards nuclear, and hopefully we're going to reach that stage that you were describing before. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for one more round of questions for each of the panelists. So let me go back to Mr. Rebrov. Are there lessons that to be learned from the financing arrangements of other generation projects that can be applied to nuclear financing in your view?
George, of course they are. Besides traditional green business in nuclear sector, Rosatom has recently entered several new business areas. One of them is wind energy power generation. The first project that we made, we arranged a special financing solution for the project. The project was covered by the guaranteed electricity price and return on investment rate put into the special capacity supply agreement with the state. And as a result, we achieved the following terms. The bank entered into the project with 90% of the financing. And what is more important, there is no special recourse on Rosatom's subsidiaries and Rosatom as well during the operation phase, during the payback period. The rest, 10%, is given by Rosatom itself. We believe that that could be named, or it has all the rights to be named as a best practice. And of course, we are coping and using it in our nuclear projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rebrov. And indeed, I think there's a lot of examples around the industries around the world that we could be using and looking. We don't have to reinvent the wheel just for nuclear. So thank you very much for that example that you gave us, which I didn't know about. Justin, let me go to you and talk a little bit more about electricity markets. Do electricity markets give a clear incentive to investment in low carbon generation and infrastructure in your view? And what would clear signals to invest in nuclear look like?
Yeah, I think on balance, I think the short answer to this would be that no, I don't think that the markets currently give a sufficient signal for low carbon generation. And there are a few reasons for that. I think one is that, in particular, obviously low carbon generation, in order to have the right investment signal for these kinds of infrastructures, it would be necessary to have some kind of effective long-term carbon price signal. Signal to investors, to users, to either kind of build more of low carbon generation or low carbon infrastructure, or otherwise to reduce their consumption of higher sources of or technologies that have higher emissions. And I think that simply isn't really present at the moment. What we do have, of course, in a number of countries are taxes of various kinds on different kinds of technologies or different kinds of activities or fuels. And I think that while that is helpful, very often what we see is that there is potentially quite a lot of variation in the if you like, the effective carbon price built into those tax incentives, which then means that you don't get the sort of necessarily the right kind of competition between different fuel types or different technologies that you would get if you had a sort of an overarching kind of market-wide price signal. Clearly, in some countries, the European Union's emissions trading scheme obviously provides a carbon price. Different countries have similar kinds of cap and trade systems. And these do provide a uniform market price that, applies to, if not all segments of the economy or all infrastructures, perhaps in the future could be expanded to cover more, and therefore would provide, ostensibly, it would seem that they would provide a useful carbon price signal for investment in low carbon generation and infrastructure. But unfortunately, these mechanisms, depending on the rules and the mechanics of how the trading is done and how the price formation is undertaken, then these prices don't necessarily reflect, the sort of the long-term risks and costs of climate change. And I think there are kind of political or let's say policy-related reasons for this. Obviously, in some countries where you have very high carbon prices or carbon taxes, that can then affect the prices of electricity and other services to consumers and industries and producers of various goods and services, and reduce the overall competitiveness of the economy relative to other neighboring countries that don't have such price signals. And I think overcoming that is going to require some international coordination, or at least some kind of alternative policy mechanism to shield, if you like, those users and producers and industries that are within a zone where there are high carbon prices and effective carbon prices from the sort of what they might perceive as to be inefficient or, let's say, unfair competition from outside of that, where those other producers and competitors don't face the same incentives. So I think, and that's going to take some time to, I think, resolve itself. I think the other sort of aspect around it is, coming back to the point I was making earlier, the market arrangements just simply don't internalize the costs that different infrastructures impose on the system, and therefore the pricing of electricity or other sort of infrastructure services may not be priced correctly. And again, government policies can have a very adverse effect on the stability of the regime, the regulatory and the policy risks, and that can undermine investment in a low carbon infrastructure, and particularly nuclear new build, and especially because the time horizons for nuclear are so much longer than almost for any other technology, particularly in the electricity sector. So I think with these considerations in mind, I think we're not quite there yet. I mean, as to what would it look like to have a clear signal? I think what we would need to have is essentially just more robust and market arrangements, and particularly also arrangements for the pricing of carbon. And also, I think in the absence of that being available in the near term, you need these other supporting policies. For example, as the European Union, as part of the European Green Deal, they're talking about having carbon border tax adjustments, for example, in order to provide as a complement to having a much stronger carbon pricing signal in the future. So I think these are the kinds of policies, unfortunately, because of the difficulty in achieving kind of thorough long-term kind of coordination agreement on climate action, it means that these kinds of policies need to be working in concert and designed very, very cleverly, if you like, in order to be able to achieve the right incentives in the absence of that.
Thank you very much, Justin. And certainly, we've seen that the way that electricity markets are structured and what kind of incentives are given have a direct behavioral impact on people's investment and how do they look at their assets and the value of them. And we've seen, unfortunately, situations in the United States where, because of the structure of the electricity markets, good assets operating nuclear power plants have to shut down because they're just losing money, although we're talking about climate change. Thank you very much for that, that discussion, Justin. Let me go now to Leonardo to talk a little bit about levelized cost of electricity. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of the levelized cost of electricity approach to comparing costs of different generation source, and what else do we need to take into account to have a fair comparison?
Thank you very much, George, for this question. That's a very hot subject now in my country. Well, using levelized cost to compare generation costs has become widespread practices. However, the approach based on comparisons of levelized costs associated with different generation technology or any other measure of total life cycle production cost per megawatt hour provided does not take into account different system costs, effectively treating all generated megawatt hour, regardless of source, as a homogeneous product. It is a commodity governed by a single price, what electricity is not. The criticism is technical, and the fundamental objection is that cost does not measure value, as I said before. Power generation occurs at different times and in different places, having different values at each moment in each place. It would be like saying that a car costs a lot more than a bicycle, so we should all buy bicycles. Nevertheless, this disregards that car and bicycles are providing services of different natures. For decades, analysts have come up with an approach that attempts to integrate some of the key cost variables in generation technology. It's called the levelized cost of electricity, meeting internal costs, including CapEx and OpEx, until a new plant is connected to the grid. Levelized cost analysis provided evidence on 3 key points. Despite recent high-cost projects in Western countries, most new nuclear power plants have a levelized costs comparable to any other generation source, including most variable renewable energy. Levelized cost meets all costs, including CapEx and OpEx, until a new plant is connected to the grid. And levelized costs for variable renewable energy did not take into account the system costs that consumers would be required to pay, such as network upgrades to accommodate a distant generation from consumer centers, low variable renewable energy predictability, balancing and frequency control, and backup and/or storage of electricity to compensate for this variability. Levelized cost analysis does not include environmental and social externalities such as waste disposal, greenhouse and air pollution, material resources, and land use. Excluding marginal externalities, levelized cost contradicts a central point of the consideration of a clean energy technology, which is the very impact of these externalities. So there is a lot of initiatives of evaluations that go beyond levelized costs in order to consider these hidden costs in the process. But we have a long way to change minds. It's not easy to change minds. It's very easy to propose a new approach, to calculate this new approach, but to change minds is very difficult. But I believe that is fundamental if you want to get a decarbonized economy in the near future. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. Absolutely. And I really like the bike versus car approach. I will definitely use that in the future. Very, very good point very quickly. Bogdan, may I ask you another question? What is your opinion regarding the involvement of governments regarding risk reduction in a nuclear project?
I understand that in current environment, hardly any investment into any new power source is possible, especially without governmental involvement. As we can forecast at the moment energy prices and sell our futures for 1, 2, maybe 3 years in advance, even if to do so, the market and also the prices are very volatile. And it's very difficult to create economic model which is very long term, viewing only 3 years ahead, and then there is the question mark. So governmental role and government involvement is very needed to reduce all of these risks. There is very long lead time for construction of nuclear power sources, maybe the longest in power industry, and long lead time and related construction and operating risk lead to high financing costs. And while cost of financing represent a significant part of levelized cost of energy from nuclear plant, it's necessary to think about some supporting mechanism. As example, in order to achieve low and competitive power prices from contemplated new nuclear unit, Czech government is proposing a law which is based on investors in nuclear units will get an offtake agreement for electricity produced, and then it brings financing support directly from the state budget, and it is reducing this levelized cost of energy, and it's bringing the favor for the customers in general, because they will take lower energy prices at the end of the day. So government takes regulatory and market or financing risks, and of course it's the responsibility of investor to take all of investment, construction, and operational risks. So it's looking for balance between governmental role and investor role, and creating environment which will create stable conditions for financing and new build, which is long-term goal.
Thank you very much, Bogdan, and I agree with you. You know that the role of government is complementary and supportive and important, especially because a lot of the benefits that come with nuclear are sovereign in nature. They are long-term. That is very hard to find the economic rationale within the specific project or specific time, but they're long-term and they're society-wide. So thank you very much for that. And we have a few more minutes, so we have one more question for Mr. Zheng Mingguang. We're seeing international partnerships as vital to securing investment in nuclear new build. What are the criteria, in your view, for establishing a successful partnership?
I think the partnership is very important for the nuclear power development. In China, actually, a lot of the utility of the electrical power would like to become the owner of the nuclear power plants, but there's requirements of the qualification. So the government actually, they have the, very high, limit for the, in terms of, but, in different way, they can share, for example, take some share. They are not the owner of power plants, but they can become the share. So they can participate the investment for the nuclear power plants. Like just, 1 month ago, there's a new project China approved by the government. And even, the private, shares can also enter the nuclear power. So the partners not only for the government to control the company, but also for the private company, they can take part in the share of the nuclear power, development, and nuclear power, operation. So in future, most important for the nuclear power industry, first we think the safety with the continuous upgrading of the technology, and the second, most important, is the continuous development of the nuclear power projects. If there's no new projects, there's no promising, no young people to enter this field. So we think most important is continuously to have the new projects. This is very important. And the third very important actually is the economy. If there's no economy, there's no partnership. No partner would enter. So we think safety and continuous development of the nuclear projects, and also the better economy of the nuclear power industry itself. So we should actually, as we just mentioned, to establish the complete supply chain of the equipment. And also we should have a platform for the spare parts internationally, worldwide. This is also very important. Not, one country can hold all the, the products, but the international cooperation also very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, it is very important. And I've seen international cooperation being very successful among players that you would not expect they would be able to cooperate, but they do, and they do well in complementary and sharing the risk and working together. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful example and a nice way to finish this panel. I would like to thank everybody for your great contributions. It's personally an honor for me to be at the same panel with all of you distinguished gentlemen today. And I think that what we discussed today is very, very important. It's, as we saw for the audience, as we saw, nobody really talked about technology. And this is a point that I think is really important. Technology is good, as we have great technologies, but the issue for bringing in investors, developing and financing goes to the issue of risk, goes to the issue of markets, and goes to the issue of cost overruns and looking at the totality of the project and the risks that it creates and why a rational investor would come into that project. So all of these answers that we had from the participants, from the panelists today, I think gave us some really great examples, and they are worldwide. We have the same examples and the same issues all over around the world, collaborating, sharing knowledge, sharing lessons learned, what works, what does not work is going to be vital for the success of our industry. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you, I guess, next year in London, I hope.